Welcome to Education Forum. I'm Herman Badillo, Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the City University. The improvement of education affects all New Yorkers. This program will focus on the key educational issues and challenges before us all. My guests today are the founders of the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. Richard Gilder and Lou Lehrman are both graduates of Yale University, and they're both enormously successful in private enterprise. Richard Gilder is the founder of the Gilder, Cagnon, Howe and Company Private Investment Fund, and Lou Lehrman is the chairman of 10 Squared, another investment fund, and of course you all remember that he ran for governor of New York State. But in typical fashion, whatever they do tends to be enormously successful, and they decided to become involved with American history. And they established some years ago the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. And here are some of the things they've done. They have amassed probably the most significant private collection of American history documents in New York City at the Pierpont Morgan Library, 36th Street and Madison. Well over 35,000 documents that trace American history from the beginning to today. Nobody else has done that. They also provide training for teachers in the high schools, and they also provide many different programs which we'll talk about today. But what fascinated me about them is this dramatic interest in American history. Why did you develop that interest, Reed?
Well, it was a combination of things. My father used to take me to Civil War battlefields, Herman, and that's where I began a sort of deep-seated love of American history, which I went on to major in. But Lou taught history at Yale and Harvard, so I think together we've sort of been like guys bidding each other up, and in this case, our own maybe down-deep love of country and willingness to make sure others felt that same sense of joy and pride and occasionally misery in our history.
Lou, how did you happen to start the collection that you now have?
I was a undergraduate at Yale. I majored in history. Then I went on as a Carnegie teaching fellow at Yale. And there was a little bookshop which was at that time selling historical manuscripts and documents, actually primarily European, but there were a few American letters and manuscripts, ancient broadsides. And you could buy them for $3, $5, $7, $12. In fact, Professor Davis and I have talked about that. And that's how I started, but we really didn't get seriously into the business of building an entire collection based upon the canon and the events and men and women of American history until Dick and I collaborated together beginning in the late 1980s.
Now, if I were to go to the library, what could I find there?
Oh my goodness. Well, you could find the 13th Amendment signed by Mr. Lincoln in the Total Congress. You could find a fragment of the House Divided speech, perhaps putatively the speech that might have started the Civil War. We've got, of course, an original Declaration of Independence. Well, this is the Stone edition, which was published some years later, so I guess it's not the original. Help me out there, Lou.
It's an original edition. It just was the second printing.
Second printing.
And we actually begin with the letter announcing the discovery of the New World by Columbus in Italy. There are 3 of them, and ours is one of them. We also have, these are just interesting curiosities in American history that precede.
Well, how did it end up in Italy if he came to discover it through Spain?
But that's where he was, and that's where he had it printed and it circulated. Now, there were many more printings because in those days, very often the way in which you just communicated was by printing, as opposed to writing and copying laboriously, you know, a scripted letter. So we don't know how many of the actual printings of that letter. Oh, good.
This is the Columbus letter.
But we do know that several have survived, and one became available years ago, and Dick and I bought it because while there's much controversy about Columbus and the role he's played in American history, nevertheless, it's considered a seminal date, and for those for and against the Columbus expedition, all recognize the important. You also would find a lot of the documents from the American founding. Even, for example, Mr. Lincoln's signed copy, 3 signed copies of the Emancipation Proclamation of Mr. Lincoln. A wonderful trove of letters from the great black abolitionist Frederick Douglass. I mean, a very large group of his letters, and he was an authentic American genius, up from slavery, self-educated, and every bit as eloquent in some respects as Mr. Lincoln.
Well, I got involved with the subject of American history when I was at a committee meeting at the City University, and I very casually asked, what is the policy with respect to American history at the City University? And the Vice Chancellor said it's an optional course. And I was shocked because the same people have been telling me that most of the students at CUNY were not born in the United States. So it seemed to me that it would be logical that the students should know something about American history. And then I found out that you had commissioned some kind of poll that indicated how poorly the students' knowledge of American history is. You want to tell me something about that?
Dick, I mean, you've really been profoundly interested in the curriculum of American New York State high schools.
Well, there's been a lot of work done even nationally, and the level of understanding is probably 20% at best is what it should be. And the interesting thing is we're a nation built on ideas. And so whether our parents came yesterday or whether they came 300 years ago, those same ideas govern. And so the ideas must be understood. And that's why we're so keen. I mean, men died for these ideas in the Civil War and in the Revolutionary War. So it's so important for our new immigrants especially, plus our older families, to get reacquainted with their real origins in these very important ideas, the key one being all men are created equal.
Now, you developed a program in the high schools to teach American history, right? Tell me about those.
Well, we decided some years ago, there was a very gifted superintendent of a Queens district named Erwin Altman, and he came up with the idea of Saturday academies, which would be optional, but kids would get credit for them, taught by Board of Ed teachers. And so we have 5 or 6 of those, I think 1 in each borough, and maybe a couple in Queens, where from 9 to 12 on Saturday, high school students come and learn the basics of American history, American jurisprudence, free market economics, things to do with the basic ideas in the Constitution and the Declaration. And they do get some credit for that. And then the idea spread to, why don't we have a high school itself, a full-time high school that would concentrate on that. And Erwin Altman died of cancer some years ago, so they named, it's called the School of American Studies in Queens, but the parenthetic name is the Erwin Altman School of American Studies.
And that specializes in American history?
Well, the kids give up all their electives, Herman, and those electives then are surrendered to studying aspects of American history. And so they take a standard high school program, but American history every year, 1 time, sometimes 2 sessions, 2 different subjects. And we enrich that with guest lecturers, with trips to Philadelphia, Boston, Washington, sometimes Gettysburg. We have many of our documents around the place, and we encourage the kids to use documents which we can easily reproduce and work with them.
But why isn't American history automatically given at the average high school?
Well, we think it should be, and we believe that the example, for example, of the Academy of American History, by the way, it's been supported by the public school system. So our teachers are from the public schools. Mike Serber,
but
the
that's
principal.
that's the few high schools that you have. But my question is, why can't it not, American history not be taught at every high school automatically?
It should be. It used to be legislated by the state legislatures in each of the 50 states, American history as well as civics, which of course explain the unique form of our government and all the difficult transitions it's gone through from slavery through abolition, Jim Crow, and then the post-World War II developments, which have seen a much greater opening of American society. That was when I was in high school and in grade school. This was a mandated.
So what happened?
Part of the curriculum.
It happened when I was in high school too.
Social studies became very fashionable in the world of teachers' colleges and schools, and for many good reasons. But it then commandeered the idea of teaching school children, high school kids especially, about all kinds of sort of technical and specialized areas of the way in which society works, without focusing on the unique and authentic aspects of American history, without acquainting them with what the founders did, and why they did it, the ideas for which they stood. They abandoned the focus on the causes of the Civil War, the sacrifices made by blacks and whites together in order to abolish slavery. And it's our belief that through the Academy of American Studies, Mike Serber, Cy Flegel, Howard Saratan, all of their efforts with the school authorities, that we can show a model that could be replicated not only in New York City, but throughout the state, perhaps throughout the entire country, which is why Dick, I think, mentioned Milwaukee and Washington, where we're conducting similar experiments.
Well, we now got the core curriculum for the City University approved a couple of weeks ago by the Board of Regents.
Congratulations. We cheered that. That was really exciting.
And I hope that the main message which I delivered is that we should now be teaching American history in the City University in all the colleges as a required course. What would you like to see be taught in those colleges?
In American history?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
American history really begins long before the arrival of Columbus, which has been made clear by the finest scholars of early American history. It begins with, well, the red men who crossed the Bering Straits like 10, 15,000 years ago, and yellow men, Chinese who came over here to build the railroad, and black men and women who were forced to cross the Middle Passage as slaves, and of course white Europeans who came here in the 17th century. The way in which our country was established, the immigrant characteristics of it, the conflicts that eventuated in what we now have through the heroic efforts of certain men and women, both in battle and simply in the fight for the idea that all human beings are created equal. This is the essential theme that we dwell on in this book that was authored by Professor Davis of Yale, and that's the essential theme that we think is especially American.
You see, we'll be back after these announcements.
If you took away a star for every 1 million people who didn't vote, and a stripe for every 5 million non-voters, and a patch of blue for the 10 million people who didn't care, exactly what kind of flag are we waving?
We're back today with Dick Gilder and Lou Lehrman, who are the co-founders of the Gilder-Lehrman Institute of American History. And Lou, you were talking about the development of American history, but the fact is that American history is not static. For example, last week, the New York Times had a big article that said that contrary to what had happened in the past 50-some years or more, now Grant is up and Lee is down, because there has been a reevaluation of their careers based upon information. How does that happen?
There are fashions in American history as in everything else. It is true, Grant is up. I mean, he's thought by many military experts today to have been the greater general. He was also a greater writer, and he was a great surprise as well, whereas General Lee himself, right from the very beginning in West Point, had been a star.
Grant was always very high-tech, Herman. He had the latest telegraph. He wrote orders with incredible precision, and he'd write them late at night, one after one, and drop them on the floor, and then he'd pick up the whole stack. They'd be in perfect order. I mean, you see, the whole thing about orders is they've got to be clear and concise and without any chance of misinterpretation.
But how did he get to be a great writer? Because at the end of his life, he was almost bankrupt, right? And the fact that he wrote great books saved his fortune.
That's right. In fact, it was the only way in which he believed that he would be able to provide for his wife and her sustenance, because he had throat cancer and he was dying. He was in terrible pain when he wrote his great memoirs. This was an authentic genius. I mean, his writing was nothing that he had practiced throughout his life. It came to him. I mean, he was a master of plain Anglo-Saxon prose and very direct, clear communication.
Can I interrupt just to go back to what
Sure,
you were saying
course,
before the break, which is the importance of American history? Because Mr. Lincoln studied American history avidly because he realized every other democracy had failed. This was our last chance. Rome went down, Greece in reverse order, the French Revolution didn't work. This was the last chance for men to be free. And so we take what we have for granted today, but it was only earned after tremendous effort and high risk, especially to those poor signers of the Declaration, many of whom, just died terribly under British privation and capture.
What would you say is the greatest moment in American history if you had to choose?
The Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, that followed it, and then ultimately, probably more importantly, was the 14th Amendment, because that was the instrumentality which enabled the generation after World War II, or even during World War II, to abolish segregation in the armed forces, and then to systematically abolish segregation in law in the 60s, and then I think increasingly in fact in the 80s and 90s, and hopefully in the 21st century completely.
And what would you say is the most important thing we have to accomplish if we're going to continue the successes in American history?
Abolish prejudice in the heart, so that what we now have in law, and increasingly in fact in schools and shops and in social life, becomes well, the law is written in our hearts, and it really has to take hold.
Now, people are saying that this is now the 21st, the American century, where we are now the only real superpower, and we will dominate the world. You know a lot about globalization. Dick, what's your opinion about that?
Well, I think the ideas, it's one reason we decided to make this collection and do it so quickly, was that we felt that this might be the last chance to, in a way, push up the market, buy all kinds of important documents, because the whole world now might be reconsidering its own structures, its own governance, its own jurisprudence, and our model is the one that should become perhaps ubiquitous, or at least much wider, much more broadly understood.
And you encourage development of that model by prizes that you give. Tell us about that.
Well, we give now, I guess, 3 prizes. We give what's known as the Lincoln Prize, which is a $50,000 academic prize to the best book about Mr. Lincoln, about the common Civil War soldier, or about the Civil War era in general. And I think we've given that for 10 years. We just started, haven't given yet, the E. Lincoln Prize.
Right.
Which, you want to talk about that?
No, please.
Which is for the best piece of work on the same subjects, but on the internet. With websites that people can create, and so it's an experiment. We'll see how it goes. And we've given now for the 2nd year in a row the Frederick Douglass Prize. Lou and I created the Gilder Lehrman Institute for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale 2 or 3 years ago. And the Frederick Douglass Prize, which is a $25,000 annual award. In fact, we gave this last week to David Eltis, a British-Canadian scholar, on a very important book, The Rise of African Slave. I forget the title.
That's a very good question, what the title is.
Anyway,
but it's a big book.
It's an important book, and all kinds of new interpretations. Because going back to what Lou was saying about prejudice, we feel the bottom of that is slavery. And until people really understand slavery, and people are scared to talk about it, afraid, frightened, we want to change that.
Well, as a Puerto Rican, one of the things that those of us who identify with Latin American culture understand instinctively is that slavery has been the biggest problem in the United States, because that division, that rigid division between black and white, doesn't exist in the same way in Latin America. We never had separate schools or separate toilets or separate restaurants. That institutional separation of society did not develop in the same way. And we think that's been the biggest problem, continue to be the biggest problem in the United States.
Right.
Why do you think the situation became so rigid here?
Because in this country, not only were there millions of slaves transported from Africa to the East Coast and then down into the southern states, from the sugar culture to the cotton culture, but the slave became in law a chattel, as indeed a Supreme Court justice said in 1857, a mere article of merchandise. And it was because of this legal status that was fastened on the slave in the United States, well, from the latter part of the 17th and 18th century, but especially in the first half of the 19th century, that the conflict to abolish it was ever more profound than it was with respect to slavery in Latin America in general, although I think that perhaps Brazil might be an exception.
Well, look, there's discrimination everywhere, but the rigidity of race, I mean, the obsession with a particular shade or a particular percentage of blood in the human person, I think only exists here. We seem to have an obsession with the exact shade of color that we don't feel in Latin America.
But see, so, I think most reasonable people would say that everyone has a few of his own preferences and opinions. But when you take a bias or an opinion or a preference and you enshrine it in the law, and you put the police power behind the law of making of a human person a chattel, a mere article of merchandise, you transmit that in the form of the law teaching by example from generation to generation. And that's why 600,000 men died in the Civil War, in order finally to eradicate this institution of chattel slavery, even while they were unable to eradicate the prejudice itself.
Yeah, but that's the problem. We really, it wasn't until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that we really abolished the large institutional discrimination that existed, but now we still have the feeling among people that the treatment of a person based on race can be different. I mean, we feel this. When I came here from Puerto Rico at the age of 12, I saw instinctively that in America, in this United States, you were judged by the color of your skin, more so than in Puerto Rico or any part of Latin America.
Well, we pray less and less so, and I suppose one almost can give thanks for the challenge to this generation of Americans to abolish not only the prejudice in fact, but to work at eliminating the prejudice in the heart. And it's our view, Dick and I are at one in the view that by studying and understanding the horrible institution of chattel slavery in the United States, whites, blacks, people from all walks of life will better understand how it is that here we are only 135 years from the institution of slavery, and we have a lot of work yet to do.
Now, you're training teachers in the summertime in New York City. Tell us about that.
Well, we have, starting about six years ago, Herman, we now send 30 New York City high school teachers, each to perhaps 10 different programs, so there's a total of now about 300, studying slavery at Yale, studying Mr. Jefferson at Monticello and University of Virginia, studying Mr. Lincoln in the Civil War at Gettysburg College, studying the founding period with Gordon Wood at Brown University, and there's a program at Harvard which combines history and literature. There's one in Cambridge, England this year, and we pay these school teachers to go, a small stipend, to make sure we get the highest quality and the most broad representation, because these are social studies teachers, and it bears back to what you and Lou were talking about before. We're fighting for their mind share. We want them to teach history and focus on history. And once they've come back from this summer of enrichment, which is a 1 week or occasionally 2 week program, you can be sure that they're going to focus on what they've learned. And for them, it's a wonderful time to be with other scholars and be on wonderful campuses and delve deeply into American history, and especially in focused subjects. So we're really pleased how this program is developing. We'd like to make it work nationally. We'd love to have help from all kinds of good people of goodwill around the nation to do this, because there's no reason why there couldn't be 1,000 such programs.
Well, keep it up, and many thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Herman.
Thank you, Herman.
You can reach us by email at our website, www.cuny.tv, or write to us at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016.